Today we begin the story of Abraham Lincoln. George Washington died in 1799, just 1 year before the turn of the century, 1800. Abraham Lincoln was born in 1809, just 10 years after the death of Washington. Abraham Lincoln grew to be one of our nation's greatest figures. This story is going to tell us what he did when he got older, but also how God used his childhood to prepare him for what he would do later in his life. This book is written by Ingrid and Edgar Perrin d'Aulaire. Let's begin. Abraham Lincoln. Deep in the wilderness down in Kentucky, there stood a cabin built of roughly hewn logs. It was a poor little cabin of only one room. The February wind tore at the clumsy door and made it rattle on its leather hinges. Just a glimmer of daylight sifted in through the oiled deer stretched across the single window frame. But the flames flickered gaily on the hearth. In this cabin lived a man named Thomas Lincoln with his wife and his little daughter Sally. And here it was that his son, Abraham Lincoln, first saw the world on a Sunday morning. It wasn't much of a house in which he was born, but it was just as good as most people had in Kentucky in 1809. The house and the place in which Abraham Lincoln was born was quite different from George Washington. One-room log cabin. Abe is solemn like a little papoose, said the kinfolk who came to look at him. He grows so fast I can't keep him in shirts, said his father. His mother spun and sewed. Just as fast as he outgrew the old ones, she had new little linsey shirts ready for him. And she played with him and watched him grow while the father was busy tilling the fields. Often she took Abe to a spring nearby and sat there in the shade, singing little songs and psalms to him. But the soil on the farm was meager, and the father grew tired of toiling with it. I reckon we'll be moving, he said, and he bought a farm on Knob Creek, on the other side of the hill. There Abe learned to help on the farm, even before he had his first pair of pants. He held the tools and he sat on the horse, and so Abe and his father and the horse plowed the fields together. And when planting time came, his father strode in front, and Abe toddled behind him, dropping seeds. Here's Abe on the horse. Little boys back then didn't wear pants until they got a little bit older. So that's why you see him. It was kind of like long shirts that they wore when they were babies and toddlers. One day, the father shot a buck in the woods, and from the skin, the mother made Abe a pair of breeches. That's an old word for pants. Abe stood beside her, watching every stitch she sewed. He felt very proud. Little children ran about in shirts and petticoats only, but now he would be a big boy in breeches. And Abe put on his buckskin breeches, washed his face and hands in the brook, and went off to school with his sister. The road to school was 2 miles long. On the way, they met other children who came trotting down from the hills, all about to the schoolhouse in the valley. There they sat together, big and small, reading and writing and reckoning aloud, that means doing mental math, all at one time together. There was such a chatter that it could be heard a long way off. But when Abe was 6 years old, he had learned both to read and write. After that, he didn't go much to school. During this time, just like some of the other people we've read about, young children were often needed to help on the farm because they had to grow crops in order to eat and survive. And so he had learned to read and write, and then most of his time was spent helping out his family. Abe lived down in the valley, and up on the hill lived a boy he played with often. Between the valley and the hill ran a brook, and across the brook there lay a log. The boys had to run over that log to get together to play. One day it had rained so hard that the brook ran fast, and the log across it was slippery. With a big splash, Abe fell head first into the water. If his friend hadn't come running and fished him out with a pole, he would have drowned. Abe's father didn't like to have neighbors too close by. "It is time to move when you see the smoke of your neighbor's chimney," he said one day when Abe was 7. "I reckon we'll be moving." This time they traveled far, more than 100 miles. They rode and they walked and they ferried until they left Kentucky and came to Indiana, the new state. There they borrowed a wagon and traveled on, right into the wilderness. The roads became narrower and rougher, the forest darker and denser. At last they stopped in the midst of the woods at a place called Little Pigeon Creek. "Here we'll build our new home," said Abe's father. While they were chopping trees and building a shelter, the autumn sky and golden leaves were their roof. The shelter they built had only 3 walls, with an open hearth where the 4th wall should have been. Day and night they had to keep the fire burning. In a corner, they put up a bed for the parents. On the ground, they spread bearskins over piles of dried leaves for Abe and Sally to sleep on. Then they unpacked the pots and pans and household goods and settled down for the winter. And where Abe and his father had cut down the timber, they plowed and planted between the tree stumps. So you see here, do you see this little, it's a 3-sided house that they built. This reminds me of Sarah and her father. Do you remember they built the very same type of house when they went out into the wilderness? It was 3-sided, and then one side was open so that you could cook because they didn't have a fireplace yet. So they had to be able to cook. But can you imagine what it was like that first winter to just have no barrier between you and the cold? You see over here, that's where the mom and dad would have slept, and then Abe and his sister just slept back in the corner there, just on the floor on bearskins. That winter was long, but at last spring was there. Then the distant neighbors came to help them build a real cabin. It had 4 walls, but no window or door. They had to climb through a hole in the wall to get in and out. Up under the roof, there was a loft where Abe was to sleep. Slowly the wilderness changed into a homestead, Often, Abe and his family had only corn and potatoes to eat. But when hunting was good, the father brought game from the woods, and Abe and Sally found berries and honey. And once in a long while, the mother baked gingerbread. One day, his mother gave Abe 3 giant gingerbread men all at once. He ran out under a tree to eat them slowly, all by himself. But hardly had he nibbled at the first one when a greedy little boy spotted him and said, "Abe, give me a man," the little boy said. Abe gave him the larger one. The boy crammed the whole gingerbread into his mouth, and before he had swallowed it, he said, "Abe, give me the other." And Abe gave him the other one too, for he didn't know how to say no. "You seem to like gingerbread men," was all he said. "Abe," said the greedy little boy, "nobody ever loved gingerbread as much as I do and gets so little of it." Slowly Abe ate his one gingerbread man and wondered why the things he liked best were always the hardest to get. And there we see just a little bit of what Abe was like as a child. We see that he's very generous. So we're going to stop there for today. Today you're going to color the picture of Abe as a baby. This picture here of him just starting to work the farm with his dad. And then on Wednesday, we will continue our story of Abraham Lincoln.